So the US education system, there are over 6,000 institutions. And so that is private institutions. We'll talk about private and public in a second, but private institutions, there'll be profit and nonprofit and state institutions. So there's so much language around what our institutions are in the United States. One piece that I want to start with is our community college and junior colleges. Depending on what your desire is in coming to the United States and the experience that you want, I have worked with many students who decide to go to a community college or what we call a junior college, 2-year college in the United States for English language programs. A lot of times they can be more intimate sometimes in those spaces, and the cost can generally be a little bit lower. So, and we'll talk about costs later as well. But keep in mind that the community and junior colleges, they're seen very differently internationally. And in the United States, they're really seen as based in a specific community and supporting that community generally, and then also supporting the needs of whatever students are interested in that program. A lot of times, community colleges can be a gateway to a 4-year institution. That was the type of community college I worked for instance. So I had almost 400 international students coming throughout the year, and then they would either transfer to a 4-year institution in the US or transfer back to a home institution that we had a partnership with. So keep in mind that junior and community colleges are almost a missed resource a lot of times that I wanted to mention today as well, just in case. University versus college is a very confusing space, and one is not better than the other. So I just want to emphasize that university is really kind of colleges or schools under one larger umbrella, where colleges can be different departments. And so it's really confusing because you may have a small university that's the same size as a college. So it's not necessarily always about the size or number of students, but generally it's about what types of programs they provide. And generally, again, not always, but universities generally have doctoral and graduate, and colleges almost always have undergraduate and maybe some graduate. But again, every school is very unique. And so you want to do your research on what types of degree programs that they provide, as well as what are the university or what are the college resources depending on the size. So we'll get to that as well. So the United States is very diverse, and the types of institutions we have match that diversity. We have 4-year institutions, and I'll talk about what research or R1 means. And so VCU is a Research One university. And so what that means is that VCU is committed to integrating research and research dollars into our curriculum and into the work that we do, embedded into our curriculum and embedded into the opportunities that we have with our community. So what that means is that generally we apply for more grant funding, and then our students are usually aligned with some of those research projects. That doesn't mean that other R1 institutions are not doing research. It just means that that is a priority of Research One or R1 schools. So just keep that in mind, that just really signals to you, if you're looking for research, then you may want to think about looking for R1 or Research One universities, because generally that's a priority that they put forward in order to maintain that Research One status. Liberal arts, or usually they're colleges, but there are some universities. Liberal arts means really a general education. So I know that happens differently across the world. Some institutions really like to focus very deeply on a very specific subject. Liberal arts in the United States is really to think about, how am I thinking as a full citizen, I guess you could say. And the idea is that you're taking a multidisciplinary approach to your program. Liberal arts institutions tend to be smaller, again, not always, but tend to be smaller, and they thrive on that community feel and small school feel. There can be good and bad to that. Universities, you can kind of get lost sometimes unless you find your group, and then liberal arts, you may not have as many access services to, for instance, community and research opportunities just because of their size. So when you think about the experience you want, it doesn't mean that one's, again, better than the other, this unique experience that you want. Think about those two different types of institutions and what would feel right to you and what type of experience you want. Rural versus urban. This is a big one. And I know that Sandra and I talked about this a little bit before we came on. It really depends on what type of, again, experience you want. It doesn't mean that a rural institution that might be larger. So down the road in Virginia, we have a school that is called James Madison University. It is really nestled in the bucolic, beautiful mountains of Virginia, but is a little bit more isolated. And so they have all the services. They're a very large university, but there's not as much accessibility to city life, for instance. So if you're looking for that quiet space in a beautiful setting, then you want to look at more of a rural institution. Virginia Commonwealth University, or VCU, is in the center of Richmond, which is the capital city of the state. And you can look at that across the United States. You will have more rural, some suburban that's kind of in between, and then urban institutions. Urban institutions provide you the access that across really Europe you experience as well. You can usually bike and walk, and there's a lot of diversity and both food-wise as well as culture as well. So really it depends on what you're looking for in your day-to-day life as it relates to deciding kind of the geography of the institution. I mentioned before the state versus private. The consideration that you should probably think about when it comes to state versus private is funding. So state versus private funding and cost will vary greatly. Generally, and again, not always, but generally state institutions are less expensive than private institutions. Sometimes you will find as an international student, though, that the costs tend to be the same because of various residency, what they call residency rates. If there's a Virginia State student, they're going to pay a Virginia State rate because tax dollars are paying the rest of that. Where if it's anybody outside of the state of Virginia, they get a non-resident rate. Some institutions even charge a different international student rate. So keep in mind when you look at tuition, it does matter what type of institution you're looking at. That doesn't necessarily mean that one's going to be less expensive than others. And when we talk about funding later, we'll consider those components as well. The other piece that you want to consider with state versus private and urban versus rural is the cost of living. So you may have a less expensive New York City institution, NYU, for instance, and you may get a lot of grants for that, but then your cost of living is very high. And so always consider also in your costs and when you decide what type of cost of living and where it's located.